All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked. And as always, we are stoked to be with you this morning. And we're doing this new thing about, not new thing, but we're coming to you live on Facebook, which is kind of a cool thing because we want to continue to work on our interaction and what we're doing with different ways that New Wine is seeking to interact. And social media is obviously with COVID has become more and more vibrant and used in all of our lives. And so this is one of the ways that we're seeking to do this, but also it's a way in which we can see if, or does this even apply to the church? Does the church have the ability to extend over the social media and connect? Part of New Wine, for those of you that have been involved with New Wine and understand, and maybe this is the first time you've ever been exposed to New Wine, but New Wine is about engagement of culture, Christ-centered, spirit-led engagement of culture. And so we've been talking about this, and especially since Easter, but we've been talking about this, the engagement of culture from the church's perspective, and the truth of suffering, the truth of stepping in and doing life together has continually been put forward in our conversation, in our dialogue. And last week we were talking about the idea of watching and praying, and what is the church's response. And I don't know if you two have been paying attention, over this, especially in April, leading into May, for Oregon, Washington, and even some churches in California. There have been some outbreaks, and so the churches have been, pushing to meet. A couple of the churches in Oregon actually sued because of the meeting, and the number, and then there are some outbreaks with the churches. And then we find ourselves in this predicament of, is the media blaming the pandemic and super spreaders on churches? Is that a false blame, accusation, or is it true that the churches are promoting and participating in some of these spreading events? And if that's the case, is this the church living righteously, or living maybe it is spirit-led, saying, hey, we're not going to be masked, we're not going to worry about it. So when we talked about this, and last week I wrote down on my notes the idea of watching and praying. Watch and pray. The Christians, we talk about God being word and deed. The Logos, Christ, is the word of God. And the Old Testament tells us that the word of God never returns void, never returns empty to the Lord. So Christ is sent from heaven, steps down, interacts with us, and in returning back to the Father, doesn't return empty. What is he not returning empty with? The reason for is because it does matter if Christ is this central figure in this God's drama of salvation, his life. So what did he return back to the Father for? And what does that mean for us today? If the church is to watch and pray, that doesn't mean passivity in the sense of not doing anything, right? It means active participants. But is that being done with these churches suing the state government and meeting in defiance of sometimes the numbers, or is getting together and doing these things an act of faith where the church is watching, they're praying, and they are acting? Where is the movement forward, especially as May comes about? How do Christians move forward? Watching and praying, what does that look like? Is that an act of activity? Or do we see watching and praying as just being something passive? And this is why then when we talk about the church praying, people don't feel it, because it's just a passive act. Watch and pray today means what? And how does the church continue to move forward in light of society opening up?
Dead air again. The notion that stepping back just a moment, and just understanding that how we engage the culture wars. I know that's such a weird phrase to use. How we engage is not going to be we as the church, how we engage is not going to be the same way everyone else engages. We're not dueling ideas. We're not doing that kind of stuff. We're entering this knowing we have Jesus Christ, and so in part, our weapons and the way we fight is just going to look different. They're going to feel different. They're going to feel uncommon to the rest of the world. So the notion of watching and praying, you're right, Matt. It's not passive, but in a sense, we're watching and seeing how God is moving and responding to just that, and seeing where he is in the world, and we're jumping on how he's responding. Now, the same token, I see that we try to push the envelope by saying, hey, if we're not meeting in this place for 2 hours once a week, therefore we're not responding to God. But God is in the world. I mean, we're more afraid of sin than God is. We're more afraid of craziness going on in the world than God is. So why don't we respond to God and follow his lead, in the things that are going on? So that's where I see watching and praying. It begins with understanding that our weapons are going to seem, it's not going to be like the rest of the culture or the rest of the world dueling, but we're going to respond to God and seeing what he's doing out here in the world.
In some ways, uh, um, I think when churches reopen out of fear of persecution, or they're saying we're reopening because we're persecuted, and then upon reopening they receive uh, backlash for reopening, then it's like this cycle of, see, I am persecuted. It's like, no, you weren't persecuted, and then you put other people in harm, and now you're getting accountability, and then it's persecution bias. And I wonder if it doesn't come down to the narratives by which we understand our reality or live out our faith. Robert Jensen talked about in a First Things article about how the world has just lost a meta narrative. How in this postmodern world, we have a nihilistic tendency. And as much as evangelicalism or fundamentalism has tried to combat that nihilistic tendency, I wonder if that nihilistic predisposition of quote unquote postmodernity hasn't infiltrated fundamentalism and evangelicalism. That the very thing evangelicalism tried to fight against is actually the very thing that's driving. It's the drive, the death drive of evangelicalism, because the way we act is not we, sorry, the way evangelicals and fundamentalists act very much reflects well, this is all going to hell in a handbasket. So let's hurry up and get there so that we can get out. And I think that's a tendency of like, who needs to be afraid of COVID? If we're going to die, we're all going to die anyway. But evangelicals know that, we're safe. And so, and the like, and it all comes down to a narrative perspective. What's the story that people are telling themselves? What's the story that we're living out and trying to make into reality?
And don't you, it's interesting that you bring up Jensen in this, the loss of the narrative. Part of the thing that I looked at through my doctoral studies, but also then into writing my book, was this idea, this loss of story, almost in this sense. Then we do find this, especially when it comes to racial issues and tension, sexual issues and tension, and this push. I was reading this book from Leslie Newbegin. I think it's called Proper Confidence. And he's talking about the age of doubts, and he brings up philosopher Lessing, and Lessing talks about these accidental happenings and histories and how we have this personal narrative. But what's happened, whether you want to call it the postmodern movement, or maybe even the reaction, the continued reaction, the unintended consequences of what happened biblically from the garden, and so I think Christians, what we find, at least this is my take on it, we all talk about God's interaction. We all talk about wanting to be discerning. And when I say we, I take is exactly what you did there, Tony, when you say we, and then you start talking about evangelicals and fun. It's hard because I think there's for the three of us and for New Wine, there's a want to say we, meaning the faith community. But nowadays, the church has made it to where we actually have to distinguish within the church now, and I think this is where one of the things that, if nothing else, the Christian community has to really be mindful of. And I think this is why dialogue is so crucial, but I think this is why it's failing, is we're not careful and we're not intentional with our language. And at our church just the other weekend, I know people think, oh my gosh, does everything have to be an issue? And I don't want it to be an issue, but I also want it to be where, so the pastor was up there and he's talking, and he was making a comment about, we were doing a service outside, but he was making about a comment about how you could use that umbrella, but if you're a guy, you have to be secure in your manhood. I like comments like that where Christians, we don't understand. And I was like, I didn't understand it because the umbrella, it had smiley faces on it. Okay. That to me is not, and secure in your manhood could be so many other things. I thought one would say you should be secure in your own personhood because it's smiley faces, which what does that insinuate? Nothing sexual. It insinuates that you're probably a happy person. So if you're someone like the majority of us who through COVID has dealt with mental health issues in the sense of depression, things like that, you should be secure because people are going to think, oh my gosh, you have yet he made it in, he wasn't even meaning to say a comment that was weighted, but he wasn't thinking through in his own wording. And I think sometimes when the church, the Christian church, we're not intentional in understanding of the language that we use. So what we do is then we just discount dialogue because in not understanding and being intentional in our language, we say things that are inflammatory and people blow up. And then every time the church is talking, there are people that want to engage and participate in this. And then it comes out with like things like that you're saying, Phil. We kind of cringe when we hear this culture wars. We're like, it's true though. And we have these competing cultures, which is because we have these competing narratives. And it goes back to however you want to look at Jensen, you want to look at Lessing, you want to look at this push where, when did it start? 1880s, early 1900s, this postmodern eruption where we have competing narratives. Nietzsche has understood the impact of the loss of Christianity, right? It moves into nothingness. The thing is, though, without a biblical understanding, we're afraid of that. And yet, isn't that what Christ calls us to do? He calls us to move into nothingness, right? There is a positive aspect of negativity. And yet within the Christian world, we were talking, my daughter and I were talking, because there's such a push for mental health. There now is this toxic positivity where especially if you're a Christian, everything is happy. And hey, Dr. Metzger is going through a tragedy. We know that God is sovereign, but when you're going through a tragedy, Phil, I'm sure you can speak into this. The one thing you don't need to hear is that, hey, this is all God's purpose, right? This is working out for God's plan. God has a plan. Yet, if he is the God of all creation, I hope he has a plan. I don't believe in an open God. But that's my concern, is like this watch and pray thing. I agree with you, Tony, that this postmodern thing leaves that where then it becomes kind of empty for the church because we don't even understand the narrative in which we're working from. Christ has come, but what is that for? What does he return to the Father for? And then the implications of that on our faith today.
Yeah, a couple of things, Matt. First off, the notion of fear that you raised a moment ago, the fact that I think many folks out here are afraid to say the wrong thing. So in lieu of saying the wrong thing, I just won't say anything. In the same context where the stories of individuals have become more significant as evidence to just particular way of life, that we want our story to be out there. Everyone's telling more so about telling their story right now. But then in lieu of that, if I'm gonna say something wrong, I don't want to engage with this story. I'm just gonna agree with the things you want me to agree with. But at the same token, we got to have some honesty in the middle of that, because there's a lot of inauthentic, oh boy, I'm going to say something crazy. There's a lot of inauthentic people that are hearing stories that are agreeing with things that they absolutely can't stand. And rather than saying that in the public sphere, they're going in their private spaces and saying that. And it's like, yeah, there's a level of, yeah, I need to say things that are safe. I need to say things that aren't hurting people on purpose, but there's a level that you need to learn. You need to be able to learn, and the learning is not necessarily being canceled. The learning is not necessarily losing your job, but the learning is, oh, wow, I didn't realize what I was saying or this particular frame of thinking was incorrect. So, okay, now I learn. Now I learn because of that, and then see the shirt and never lose. I either win or I learn. That with that learning, then you reframe how you understand your perspective of life, and you'll get to the moments where you'll rejoice in who we are as Christians and not look at everything saying, hey, you know, it's all going to hell in a handbasket, so let me just get on the train. So that kind of thing. So that's kind of where I take this. But at the same token, Matt, where you're bringing up with Dr. Metzger and with my family a couple of years ago, in the middle of tragedy, you don't want to hear, you don't want to hear, you know, God has a plan for this. It may be the truth, but in the middle of it, you don't want to hear. And you do come to a realization of it. But at that moment, I don't need that. What I need is just someone sitting beside me and crying along with me. So, yeah.
Yeah, it to your point, Phil, I think what you're talking about is what we've been talking about for the last year, is like our capacity to suffer and endure, not suffer like pointlessly, but to suffer alongside each other and for each other. And to the start of this conversation or this episode, Matt, where you're talking about, man, churches who are now opening and then there's a spike. Is there a false corollary saying that these churches are causing the spike, or is it incidental that the two? I think it's much more complicated than just saying that the churches alone are causing the spike. I would say the churches are contributing by and large to the spike. They aren't the sole proprietors of the COVID spikes. But it comes down to our capacity to suffer. These churches, we don't have a capacity. Like, we have a false belief that liberty is a biblical or theological category. Liberty is not a theological category in the sense that it was something Christians should live into. Liberty was a theological category because we made it one. And now we have to deal with those consequences and work out the theology retroactively. Pursuit of happiness is not a theological category until biblicists said, see, the Constitution and Declaration of Independence was inspired by biblical values. And so now we're dealing with people who don't really know how to read the Bible, who made we're just so far downstream of that. And so with churches who say we're being persecuted because our liberties are being infringed upon, Christians under Nero had their liberties infringed upon, and we live in a delusion. We live in a fantasy within the Western world. We are not being persecuted. There are Christians being persecuted in the East, in the Middle East, but in the West, Christians are not being persecuted. Christians are so privileged. If anything, Christians are the persecutors. And so, yes, I think churches are contributing to the spikes in COVID. Two, Christians do not have a capacity to suffer in the West. Three, man, what a time to be alive. It really is. But we never lose. We never lose. I agree with Phil.
Yeah, but so don't you think, though, this is the issue, is does the church ever learn? You know, because what are we like? This is the thing is, and I maybe the Christian church is just too nice, you know, when it comes to understanding faith and saying to people, hey, look, here's your life prior to Jesus. Okay, here's the church. Now, yes, you do have the right. Look at Jesus. So what do you have the right to do? You have the right to suffer and die. Like basically, and we look at that as like that's a negative, pejorative. That is the curse on your life, you know. And I think that we need to start, I don't know, maybe we've come to a point where we need to be so blatantly obvious in our faith. It says, look, dudes, here's the deal. According to the world, this faith thing that I'm going to explain to you, this is the shit house. This is what the world is going to tell you is not worth living, right? And so there is this drastic, because I think, I don't even know if it's culture wars anymore. My concern is that the church has become so embedded in culture that it looks like culture. And it's the opposite of what I think is meant to happen when Bonhoeffer and these guys were pushing for the church to become more like the world or more worldly in the sense of you're willing to interact. But we've taken that, I think, to the wrong side of the coin, in the sense of becoming more worldly means that we become more sin, as if to become more human means to become more sinful. But that's not the case. Christ did that on the cross for the church. Christ became sin. So what? For us to step more into the world means for us to be more like Christ, right? To be more human. That's what Christ came to do, is to rehumanize the human, not to make us more like this sinful world, right? And yet I feel like we've forgotten that, because biblically, we're not following the precepts and the mandates given to us by the Lord God, you know, of the Christian Bible. But what we're doing is we're taking the interpretations of the human of the 21st century and saying, oh, well, actually, the idea of inclusiveness and peace and uniformity outweigh the truthfulness of this dude named Jesus, because first century Palestinian life not doesn't equate, you know, and we're all about equity and equality, right? And I think sometimes the catchphrases of today's culture, it really does. And I think the unintended consequence of this progressive movement is that you're canceling out then truthfulness. So again, like the church wants to be a part of culture, but sometimes I think, you know, people, because the church leaders, they don't have they're so embedded into the world, so they get caught up in the world. You know, just the church down in California is dealing with one of their main leaders, Ortberg, now just resigned because, again, of church leadership issues. And what you find out, oh, well, there was abuse, you know, of their power. So the lack of the church's ability to lead is the church's own, you know, doing. And yet what we think is, well, we'll watch and pray. And that's where then with COVID, the church isn't leading. It's just sort of stumbling over itself. And because they have no directive, and yet the Bible's right there, but we're afraid of saying, oh, the Bible does have absolutes. And in today's culture, an absolute is one of the ultimate canceling outs, right? If you're not part of the majority voice of the culture, because they're canceling all the time. The church has to watch and pray so as to be strong and confident. But what is its step? You know, how do we continue to step in, lovingly embrace culture, but not become commandeered, not become colluded by, or, you know, having culture take the message of the gospel and then arrange it to where then it's more digestible, as opposed to, no, the church is the one that's supposed to be I don't want to say the mediating factor, you know, but the church is supposed to be the one that's softening this word, because sometimes it is bitter.
And a couple of things, and just thinking of the relationship between evangelism and discipleship. When, as we bring people to the faith, you know, are we showing them how, you know, the fact that you're coming to die? That's what's bound to this life, is that, yes, you can do whatever you want. Yes, you're free in Jesus, but what that means is you have the freedom to choose to walk in the very steps that he laid out before us, and then suffer behind him, and to fill up, essentially, as Paul put it, to fill up his suffering, to continue that particular legacy. That's part of what we miss. We get the idea that, oh, I can do anything I want. That means I can do anything I want. So we do. But yeah, there's a notion that, of course, we're following Jesus, and we're going to follow into his suffering, and we're live into that. That's all I'm going to say at the moment.
Yeah, to your point, Matt, with the concern that the church has become so worldly, I wonder if in some ways we have done a poor job of reading Paul. Like, obviously, we've done a poor job with reading Paul. And there are times where Paul has very strong um, things to say against the world. But I don't think Paul is ever trying to like set us up to be antagonists against the world. It's to say there are things about the world that are antithetical to being a follower of Jesus. But that just means Christians need to be aware of how God will redeem and recreate and reconcile all that is wrong within the world. So don't be susceptible to what is wrong in the world. But I think Bonhoeffer is right when he talked about a religionless Christianity. Like we swung so far to the other side of, oh, we don't want to be worldly, into now we're so pious and so religious that we're not even Christian anymore. Like in some ways, the Western church is more pagan than even the pagans. I mean, when Satanists are getting called out for doing certain things, and they're like, oh no, that wasn't us, that was the evangelicals, like we didn't do that. Like, man, you're like, oh shoot, we got a bad rap that if even the Satanists are like, hey, that wasn't us, so that's all the Jesus followers over there, like look at how we treat our women equitably, like golly, like that should give us a pause. And then if the way that evangelicals or fundamentalists or Christians are reacting are like, oh, if the Satanists are pro-women, then we're anti-women, like no rights for anybody, because if the Satanists are for it, then who is against us? The Lord's army is with us. I'm like, oh, I think we got this all wrong. And so yeah, like even Phil, to your like reaction, like for a lack of a better term, we talk about culture wars. But when you talk about real human beings outside of Christian culture and you talk about culture wars, it's like, what are you talking about? Like, in some ways, it's like the vets who came back from Vietnam who are still living out the Vietnam War. And anytime they see an Asian person, oh, watch out, that's a Charlie. Like, I don't think so. And so same thing with Christians who like live out this quote unquote war. They're stuck in this calcified battle that nobody's fighting except them, and they're creating the enemies that they want to see. We're like, we've moved on from culture wars. We understand that the world is much more complex and much more dynamic than that binary of us versus them. And if we're really going to talk about a reconciliatory presence, being peace makers, not peacekeepers, and living into the vision that Jesus has cast for his people, like we just we got to move away from being so afraid.
Yeah. Don't you think, Tony, this is the thing that again, I come back to Nietzsche. I mean, I think he understood Christianity better than, most Christians even today, but the will to power is one thing, but the will to power, this need for control, that you are trying to set up the system that no matter what anyone does, it's going to benefit you. And I feel like that's the why when we talk about, because you're right, if you go outside of the American culture, this idea of the pursuit for liberty or even happiness, and then when you come into a religious atmosphere outside of America, they look at American Christians and go, why is it that you feel like you have such a claim on these inalienable rights? I mean, especially for those that are calling themselves Christians, you have the right, again, looking at this dude named Jesus, first century, that stuff either is that truth that we've been talking about, that everything today is relevantized by, right? That truth and so what does that truth mean for the 21st century? How does the church then play into this power grabbing narrative? Because you see it playing out even politically with Nancy Pelosi's church now coming out and speaking against some of the things that she's even said, and they were trying to be the bastions of religious kind of liberty, trying to take that from the Republicans. And then you see now the political grab and the power grabs within that dynamic. And this is where the church finds herself, is that, is she going to continue to play the power grab that we see within the world, or are they going to follow her savior, which the power that Jesus gives is the gift of himself. And that starts, though, with this willingness to lay down your life. And like Phil was saying, to fill up the sufferings of Christ. That's a significant call on the person who follows Jesus. And what's even more significant, I think, that you were highlighting, Tony, is that there's no culture war for Jesus, because what does he say? The war ends with the Christian because they are to love their neighbor. There's no more enemy anymore, because what has happened with the enemy? The enemy has been loved into relational truth, because as we love our neighbor as ourselves, the person in front of us, I'm not seeking to war them. I'm not seeking to battle them. The battle's not mine. That's what Paul, if you're right, Tony, we need to read the Apostle Paul a little bit. He says the battle's not ours. 2 Corinthians 10 talks about the spiritual battles. These are going on, but that doesn't mean that it disengages us from this activity that has been ongoing since, Christ defeated the powers of death and sin. Yet the church, it seems like the church is questioning whether or not what happened in the first century really did happen, because if it did, wouldn't it grip our hearts to where then the conversations we're having, we're like, yeah, it's not binary. It's not an us and them. I'm talking with another New Wine leader about this book we're seeking to write on, like kind of rediscovering the sacred. We have allowed there to be such a divide between sacred and secular, as if there are things that were created outside of God's realm, outside of that sixth day, where, in the creation story, where it says that God created them male and female, and he saw that it was very good. I'm not sure if the Christian church actually believes in our very goodness, because if we did, that there would be no one in front of us, whether they're whatever their sexual orientation is, whatever their ethnic orientation, whether their ethnic reality, whether their marital status, their education, all those would be labels that, like Paul says in Philippians, these are the things of the world and I count them but rubbish, right? How come the church is missing that? Like, where have we missed this? Die to self so as to live for the other. What Luther says, in Christ we ascend, in Christ with the Spirit to the Father, so as to descend in the Spirit to our neighbors. Where, like, what that basic message of the gospel, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor, where has that been lost? Like, how is it that we've messed this up? Because now it's like love self, love God, and then love neighbor.
I think it's very complex. So a variety of possibilities. One is, I think education for Christians, especially in the Western world, it has plummeted. There's a difference between indoctrination and education. And out of fear of being indoctrinated or being forced to assimilate or assent, Christians have formed enclaves that now do the indoctrination rather than become indoctrinated. So that it's always the dog whistle of, oh, look at the Marxists and the communists who formed re-education camps. They indoctrinated their citizens. So to prevent that, we're going to form our own educational institutions so that we don't let the communists and the Marxists infiltrate our government and indoctrinate us. Well, guess what? You're now indoctrinating your own people. There was a lot that the masters of suspicion got wrong about God, but there's a whole lot that they got right about people. So Nietzsche may have a lot wrong about his theology, but his anthropology is pretty dead on with Lacan, with Freud, and the like. God, you can say God is dead all you want, but God isn't. So you may have a theological misstep, but his study of anthropology is so dead on. When we talk about the death drives, like, it's latent within our society. And so because Christians no longer have an intellectual capacity, at least in the West, Western Christians are just indoctrinated. It's recycled material that is dressed up. There's no depth or value to it. I think also, on the other hand, I would say I think Western Christians have fallen into an Ananias and Sapphira narrative or trope. Um, while we are no longer battling the world, this is an internal problem, one that has ramifications for people outside of the church, because Ananias and Sapphira sold their possessions so that the church could receive funds to take care of the world, to take care of the orphan and the widow, but they withheld a portion. That's exactly what the Western church is doing. We're supposed to be turned outward for the world, but we're withholding. We're trying to protect the little parcel of whatever we're supposed to sell for ourselves. And so the Western church has turned inward. Everyone's trying to protect that little parcel of possession. And we're living that Ananias and Sapphira trope. And in some ways, we're experiencing God's judgment. God may not be smiting us, but God is leaving us to our own devices. And so I think multiple possibilities. Those are the two that I'm leaning on, though.
Yeah, and thinking of the thing that we're holding back, whether it be liberties, whether it be whatever, we're trying to hold something for our own, and that has been the thing that's kind of rotting out in the church, where we talked about it earlier in our conversation, where the church is no longer leading these kind of conversations and the like. But the idea that we don't need God, because you could pose the question, what has God done? How has God helped? In these particular situations, and looking at the way the church is operating in our world now, you get it. It's like, well, yeah, we talked about this. This was several podcasts ago when we first started. This is right after George Floyd. And I'm going to pose the question to you guys. Do you even want to talk to a pastor now when it comes to responding to these issues? Do you even want a Christian leader a part of this conversation? And we're like, if it's going to be the same voice, if you're going to say the same thing, well, no. And you can almost look at that in every sphere of culture right now. If we're going to have the same things, if we're going to have the same attitude being brought to the conversation, why do we want the Christians there at all? Why do we need God there at all? And yeah, it's saddening and painful that that's kind of where we are in many regards. And part of that is rooted in what you mentioned earlier, Tony, that we've misread Paul, we've misread Jesus, we've misread the gospel. And now we're trying to, it has been reframed into something else. And so then where do we go from here to reframe it back? Do we turn it into something else as we try to tweak it? Or do we smash the whole thing out and start rebuilding the house all over again? All right, that's enough of that.
The learning aspect is interesting when it comes to the education, because you see throughout the course of history where the church has tried to do this, and we continue to, I take your point with his theology and anthropology, with Nietzsche, that there is a lack of that, the triune foundation. I see even in the 21st century, since the 2000s, when I really, mid to 2000s, like 2005, 6, 7, in that early part, stepping into a graduate level work for theology, it was interesting. There has been continually, though, this binary reasoning behind getting an education within religious circles, is that so that we can educate them, we can, and it's not even educating them, it is the idea of apologetics. It's really bashing them into belief. It's not even relational. It's not, it is so dialectic that it is divisive, as opposed to dialectic moving into dialogue, where there is we have kept it so binary, where it's just antithesis, thesis, right, kind of thing. It's just an us and them. But dialectic has that dynamism where it if you stop it and stagnate it, it becomes just a yelling match. But if you allow then the conversation to transform through its relational truth, then it becomes the dialogue. And that's where we can engage. But we've stopped doing that because I think the church has seen that the ways of this world, and especially I'm talking in the last 10 years or so, but you could easily go to the 1990s. The ways of this world are not dialogue. They're demand. It is really the voice of the loudest one. That was never Jesus's mode of operation. He never, and even when he goes into the temple, people have a hard time making him out to be this raging lunatic throwing stuff around, how most of us would do it, to make a scene. I'm sure it was obviously it was a pretty dramatic scene, right? Jesus wasn't put on the cross because he was a good teacher and a nice dude, right? Kind of tweaking with his actions were quite offensive. And I wonder also though, do we make Jesus's actions, the offense of his actions, different than what the real offense was? We want to make the offense something that correlates to how we live, meaning January 6th was just nothing more than another turning over of the tables of the temple, right? That was just moving in. We weren't, insurrectionists were because that the temple had been taken over by the pagans, right? And so we can use Jesus's actions in the way in which we then see commandeer, and so I almost don't even think that we allow culture. It's not even that we're allowing culture to take over the biblical message. What we're doing is we've been so indoctrinated into the cultural message that when we read the Bible and we think we're doing it authentically and discerningly, we don't even see the lenses in which we have actually been, brainwashed. So that when I start talking to Phil and he brings up anything racial, or even you, Tony, and I say, yeah, you're a little bit darker tint than me, so obviously you have been skewed. Let me tell you what the Bible says. There's no racism, no slavery in here, because never going, oh, wait, maybe in my 40 plus years of living, the way in which I've been taught how to read the Bible hasn't been from this historical critical kind of perspective, but it's been historical critical based on my history and the criticism that my majority party have been telling people how to critique the Bible. We haven't even, I think, gotten into the truth of that, right? Like, where does the transcendence of Christ actually meet the reality and the immanence of our culture today? How does the church do that though? Because do you think, in your estimation today, when we step back, does the church care about that even today? The engagement of culture?
Yeah, that's why the only apologetics I ever take part in is apologizing for Christians. Like, there's nothing to defend. We severely misunderstand what apologetics is, and we use it as a blunt pocket knife, and we just go around like the zealots, like Simon the Zealot, just go around causing trouble in the empire. I think with the poor education that Christians have, Western Christians have, what I see is we recycle bad ideas as if they're new and innovative and like enlightening. Something that I've been hearing a ton of pastors talk about lately is, oh, the church is too Pauline. Like, we've read the epistles too much, and we just need to read the gospels and be a Jesus church and not a Paul church. And it's like, okay, well, let's take that to its furthest extent then. So you adhere to inerrancy and infallibility and inspiration, but then suddenly you're saying that too much Paul. But is Paul not inspired? So now you're reading Jesus against Paul, as if Paul is not reading Jesus himself, as if Paul is not a continuation of Jesus. And so it's like we get caught up, the Western Christians get caught up in this false dichotomy, and then creating solutions to problems that don't exist. Like, what you're saying, the church is too Pauline, as if Paul isn't the follower of Jesus, the greatest apostle who met Jesus, who said, I had a Damascus Road experience with the risen Lord. And I realized the people I was persecuting Jesus himself. And so where is this coming from? Creating solutions to problems that don't exist, therefore creating problems that only we can solve. That's what the church is caught up in. And so no wonder we have no healthy apologetic, because we can't answer real world problems. Let's not even talk about third world or first world. Let's talk about real world. The church is so is so off hinged on that. And so I get so fired up on that, because I sometimes I sit when I hear some pastors talk about that. I'm like, dude, you paid like $80,000 to go to seminary and they taught you how to read Paul, and then you watch one YouTube video, you read a Twitter thread, and now suddenly, oh, the church is too Pauline. And then you're like, oh, and the church can't be Peter because that's Roman Catholicism. So then it's like, oh my guys, whatever you're smoking, whatever you're on, maybe I need that, because I can't anymore.
And related to that, Tony, the fact that we can look at our church now and the way the church operates in our country now, and think of all the issues that are still in the world that the church just hasn't responded to. Of course, you would create other issues to talk about, because you don't want to talk about the stuff that's happening right here, right now. So of course you're going to create other issues, and of course Jesus is the hero to those issues. But then to our issues, we believe Jesus is the hero, but he hasn't been heroic. And maybe that's not Jesus. Maybe that's us. I don't know. All right, Matt.
Yep. No, I think that's true. And that's that's the conversation that we're continually having. We're going to continue to have this every Friday. More than welcome to join us live on YouTube and continue the dialogue. It is an opportunity for you to throw your questions up there, and who knows, even come join us sometime on the broadcast and talking about this, because this stuff matters. Faith does matter, faith seeking understanding. Well, what understanding are we seeking, and who is this God that we're pursuing? It does matter if this God is an abstract concept, or if it's the true real person who's come to interact on our behalf and with us, and then called us into a working relationship. It really is this working relationship. There's an expectation, and this continued dialogue. It's going to be nonstop. You talk to Phil, you talk to Tony, you talk to myself outside of this, and we'll tell you that this is something that's ongoing, and we can pine the depths of this and still never come to the fullness of understanding, but continue to be intrigued and overwhelmed and awakened to the goodness of this understanding. And so we're stoked that you've been joined us today, and continue to join us, because we want to bring into the questions and comments that people might have, just because we're also pursuing this God that we're talking about. Each one of us is on this pursuit, just is each one of you who are watching. And so we're stoked that you were here with us. It's been another episode of New Wine Uncorked. And as always, you know what? Join us next week. But until then, we'll see you on the flip side. On behalf of Phil, Tony, I'm Matt. We're out.